Hi, I'm Carrie Parrish. I'm here with Erin Cummins. We were getting ready to do a presentation called Ready, Set, Go at NAEA up in Minneapolis, but unfortunately we're doing it now from the social distance of each of our own homes. So we're going to try to run through some of the things that we were going to show you in Minneapolis and kind of walk you through some of the things that maybe you won't be able to potentially practice or play along like our had been our intended goal. I am coming to you from Crystal Lake, Illinois. I teach in a 4 high school district, and I am at Crystal Lake Central, teaching 90% digital arts and about 10% traditional arts.
I am Aaron Cummins. I teach with Carrie. I teach in the same district as Carrie, but at a separate high school. My high school is called Prairie Ridge High School. It's about 5 miles north of where Carrie's at. Basically, also teach mostly, probably 80% of my day is digital. I am one of 2 art teachers in the building, but the other art teacher only comes in for basically 2 periods of the day. So we will now move on. So the reason we did this, we did another presentation dealing with how you use games to get students to think like an artist. And one of the things we found was that one of the biggest things in terms of thinking like an artist is not just the whole like generating ideas and kind of moving forward, but also getting feedback and how feedback kind of moves the artistic process forward. So we incorporate this together and really start pushing the whole idea that feedback is just as important to an artist as anything else they do. And reasons for that, again, it helps the artist help others. They become part of a bigger community. In terms of communication, we draw ideas from what each of us say. We also get a different vantage point. It helps us kind of change our lenses on the world, if you will. The more you kind of communicate, talk, discuss ideas. It also helped us that in terms of our students, one of the biggest things in terms of critique, they didn't trust other art students because they didn't feel the feedback was like, it was lower level, even though it was not. They read it as such because the student wasn't exactly always using the same vocabulary. So one of the biggest things we really stress a lot of this is that an artist needs to use proper vocabulary in their feedback. And again, as you do it, they seem to connect more with what the artistic ideas are. It also helps that an artist is a good listener and that they are in the moment. They are drawn into what's going on so that they stay focused on, again, who they're addressing, but also then how they may use it later. Carrie, do you want to add anything to this?
No, I will keep talking, I guess, about feedback as we move on here. And I think it's the hardest thing for kids to learn how to do. I think as instructors, we have to give them the words. We have to start with some sentence stems. We have to give them graphic organizers because they're not used to giving feedback in this manner. So that's why we've set it up. And at first it does seem kind of scripted, but as soon as you kind of get them into that situation and they're better at giving feedback, then they kind of step away from the script and you start to hear them use these prompts and the vocabulary in their own, and it does become a part of their language, which I think is basically how we all learn to do this, but we probably learned it in college. But the one thing that I think is really important to tell students is feedback is goal referenced, it's tangible and it's transparent, but it's also user friendly. We joke all the time in class that it's not just saying something is good. It's really about using that comma and getting into more information about that work. And I always, in my classroom, I'm trying to connect the importance of giving feedback to all of the other places in your life where you are receiving feedback that are not just within that school setting. So I think that's really important. We talk about different places feedback happens all the time to kind of make
We also talk about how it's a job skill. And if you do this well, this is a job skill that people will value highly for. Because again, you're not just the yes man. You will you will think through in terms of what is the goal that we're trying to accomplish. And you have some ideas how to direct that conversation, if you will, because again, you're more understanding that feedback is meant to drive something, to push it forward.
I agree. We took our levels of our feedback, the whole idea of feedback, and we really tried to level it to push kids to really think further. This is based on Costa's levels of questioning. We're an AVID school, so we're constantly looking at levels of questioning and different levels. We also have a levels of collaboration, just to kind of show kids that you can show growth in these areas. So the first level of feedback that we start out with is really just gathering information. It's really an evidence-based feedback. And that's something in this situation where we're going to be on Flipgrid, we're going to be doing things differently than we have in the past when we were in our own buildings. We really can practice these skills with what are you seeing, and being very explicit with those identifying and gathering information piece. The second level is really more leading, where you're taking that information and you're pushing it further, you're comparing, you're asking questions, but it's really about how you're processing the information that the artist is giving you. And then the third one is really applying. It's those reflective questions that you may be asking another artist that they can't answer right away. It's one of those things that they have to sit and think about. But it also then really, those level 3 questions, really, you might not see the effect of tomorrow, but you might see the effect of those maybe next week as kids start to really process some of those things and apply some of the things that students have talked about. So we talk in terms of those levels of feedback. And just like with Costas, he uses the house as an example. You can't start with a level 3 type of feedback. You have to start with those level 1 activities to get kids comfortable and to start to develop that vocabulary so it does work.
And again, this is a process. So you'll get some level 3s kind of happening. Don't expect a lot of them in your lower level classes. It does take time. Also reference how much they do generally, to kind of like, the biggest thing is most kids aren't used to give feedback. They're used to just being the very straightforward plain, because that's what they're used to in other classes. By using the different levels, they see how they need to basically step up their game. And again, do better jobs at asking questions, trying to get something related to the goal out of that artist. Because again, most of them are also used to that kind of social media style of feedback, where it's a lot of very much just simple identifying or base gathering of information. And again, you can start there and talk about how they use that, but then talk about, okay, if you really have a good conversation with your friends, how much of that then gets beyond that? So again, it's one of those things where it does take time. And again, they have some of the skills, they just haven't used them in a way, because a lot of times they're, again, used to doing very bare basic kind of feedback, because most of their classes are kind of yes, no responses.
The biggest thing that you need to be aware of when you're working with feedback is really setting some norms, making sure that the language that you're expecting is clear. This would be a great place for you to potentially have word banks, word walls, things that you can utilize to make sure and then reinforce when you are hearing that positive language that you were looking for. Really make sure to reinforce that it's about the work and really not about the person. High school students have a problem separating those things, and they always want to kind of like help out their friend. And my biggest kind of go-to is you're helping your friend so they don't get to the end of their project and realize they made a big mistake. So as a good friend and an art and a studio buddy, you want to make sure that you're helping out your classmates along the way. And even, 6 different classmates could give you feedback, but in the end, it really is still your choice about how you're dealing with that feedback. One of the questions I frequently ask students is, what feedback did you receive? And then how did you deal with that feedback? Because I think that is also a big learning curve for kids to think of, well, I took this feedback in and then I did everything that everybody wanted me to do, even though I didn't agree with it. That's not the goal at all. It's really about how am I taking that information in and sifting through it to figure out what is my best course of action, because I think that's a much more real life skill.
As Carrie mentioned, in terms of the ground rules, I know she uses the no should statements. Again, part of this is you got to teach the kids that what feedback truly is. Because again, most of them take it as we are like the teacher, whatever they give you is the ultimate word. where that's one of the little shifts you'll see happens to students, where you become more of not the kind of leader, but somebody who's facilitating and being like, I am giving you possible suggestions. I am going to encourage you. But again, this is still your work. Because one of the biggest things we found out feedback is, one, usually it's either too vague, or you have the other end where it's too specific, and the person who's giving the feedback is actually taking ownership of that piece of artwork and almost taking away from the kid. And again, this is meant to be like, the goal is I want you to make a piece that is your voice, not my voice, your voice. I will give you suggestions in terms of how I may see you kind of trying to get your voice expressed better. But again, that's the one thing you need to be aware of as you start this off of, is you'll have kind of two extremes. You'll have the groups that's going to be very vague. You got to kind of get them to level up and actually use the right vocabulary. But then you also have the other part, the ones who want to take ownership and think they know everything and are like, oh, here's how you should fix this, 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 and this. And again, you've got to pull some of them back, because again, this is again one of those choices where the student has to like take suggestions and process those suggestions. Okay, so one of our first games is I Spy. This is a beginning level game. The purpose of this is mainly to start getting kids to use the right vocabulary. It's also to get them to get kind of connected with it. It's one of those games you can do in small doses. It's, again, a fun little kind of like starter game. Don't do large quantities of it because it can get old quick for high school students. Okay, so the way I use it is for kind of critiquing, like mainly photos, but it's a way that I can have the students look at pieces. Basically, what we do is you organize usually in teams, or you can do this individually. They have an artwork. Usually it's, again, either works in progress or works that they want to discuss. This way, again, the kid sees the artwork, and then either you give them usually a sheet of transparency. You can use plexiglass. If you have lots of printing capability, you can do it where they just draw right on the piece of the artwork. Again, I use the transparency so they can kind of like see, pull it back, and kind of look over the top. So I use dry erase markers. And then I have a series of different prompts depending on what kind of piece we're doing. Attach is one of the prompts for the photos, because that's what we normally, if we're going to present this, normally we have you give you some photos and we walk you through. So what I do is basically there's a series of prompts, and then I have the kids, go down the line, give me a number. This one thinks out of 24. And so it's like, if they choose, say, 12, it could be okay, if it has contrast, so you'll circle the area with contrast, put a +1, and then write the word contrast so that the student knows that's where they did a good job. Okay? There's also some negatives. So there's oversaturation, which would be a -2, because that's one of the ones that we see a lot where the kid will oversaturate the picture in Photoshop. And again, it kind of takes away from some of the ideas. So again, we use prompts that were meant to kind of connect students in with what we see as a lot of the beginning level problems. So they have a chance to kind of address them, see them, and identify them. I usually do it where we do it out of 5, whoever gets the first 5 pluses. And again, there is some minuses, there is some pluses. But then the winner, whoever chooses to win or whoever gets the first 5, stands up, and then we have them talk in front of the crowd where they have to identify and talk about what they marked and why they scored it the way they did. That way it reinforces them to use this vocabulary, but then also the student then will get that piece back, and they get to see where others are seeing them making positive progress, but also some things that they're saying that take away from the artwork.
Aaron, do you want to talk about your 2 samples for how you could do this digitally online?
Digitally online, you can do this more kind of, you can do it as a flip grid where you would have the students, choose a few prompts and kind of see if they can do it, and then talk about, basically circle those areas where they saw them, and then have them talk through those in terms of the same way that student stands up and references the vocabulary and talks through it. So ideally, again, they get a chance to talk through that vocabulary and identify that vocabulary.
The other way I think this could be used when online, I'm trying to think in our situation now, is I could potentially bring in a new artist, have a couple samples of maybe 2 samples of the artwork up so that students could talk about it during a class. And then they could potentially say, okay, where do you see contrast? Where do you see these things? And then have them talk about where they're seeing those things within that as a class discussion. I also feel like it's a safe way to have a class discussion because the answers and the evidence is right in front of them. So it might be a good activity just to kind of maybe as you get started with doing some online stuff. And then the kids who can't join in, they can watch it and then they can see what their classmates have said and realize that, oh yeah, I would have picked those 2 things. So it kind of is building their confidence for being able to do some of this online learning.
Or for some of you who use Screencastify, again, you can kind of use that, in something like Photopea or some other program where you can actually like highlight, circle things amongst an artwork and then talk them through, same kind of thing. Again, the biggest part of this is about using the vocabulary and identifying. So again, there's another way you can also do it.
And then we do have all of our links within this presentation go back to all of our stuff. So you should be able to see everything that we've done. I did iSpy as with a contact sheet. You could potentially do it now with a couple different images. Really, I set it up as iSpy as a fun way to have a graphic organizer. I made sure that there was a place where they were really explaining their decisions and kind of what they were looking for. And then one thing that I like to use at the beginning of the semester is I like to use word banks to remind the kids, like, these are the vocabulary that you should be using. I don't want to assume that they're going to remember them because that's not my job. My job is to put them out there so that the kids can potentially use them. So I really believe in the power of that word bank so that they can remember, oh yeah, it's Phil Dufresne. That was the one I couldn't remember it. Because some of this language is so new to them at the beginning of the semester. And again, even though we're not at the beginning of the semester right now, I mean, they're going to need word banks. They're going to need some things to set them up for some successes. And I think the word bank is a great way to make them more comfortable with things because they're not going to remember things that you taught in January. Lots has happened. They can't keep track of everything.
Okay, we've already talked about some of the advantages, disadvantages. The biggest one, again, this is beginning level. So you will be getting some more of that base level kind of feedback, which is not a bad thing. Because again, it's getting kids to start getting used to the process. And again, you can add little rewards. I know that when we start off doing this, usually, again, I usually do at most 3 if I'm doing it like one time, but it's one of those ones where you can do it again to get the kids kind of like started for the day. Because again, ideally it takes roughly anywhere from 5 to 10 minutes. It's not a long activity. It's one where it kind of gets them kind of like focused in and going. So again, it can be used again with their artwork. It can be used if you're doing art history stuff. If you're introducing a new unit and you want to get them to look for certain things that you may be like talking about. So it's a way for you also to introduce new vocabulary. Most of the kids have played it before, so they're very used to it. Some even have it on their phone as a phone game, although it's a little elementary, but some enjoy just kind of like that mind-numbing kind of like quick search for things. Also, if you are doing things where you're teaching like skills related to like 2D kind of artwork, I have also found this works very well in terms of like teaching value or shading. Because then the kids can also, instead of the word bank, they have that series of gradient values of black to white. So you can sit there and be like, okay, where do you see the number 3 gray? Okay, then you can like circle those areas and mark it out in your drawing. So it's one where it's a way up for them to connect and kind of see. But it's a nice way to also introduce that, because again, it's meant to be more fun, easygoing, where it's taking a little bit of the stress off of them. So instead of like being a critique where it's like, oh, you have to be on the spot, it's meant so that they get a chance to, again, learn it, but yet in a way that's a comfortable atmosphere.
Okay, the second game I pulled from Monopoly. Again, we're pulling games that kids are now potentially going back to, but just basic, really simple things that they can relate to. really basically a lot of these are really just graphic organizers, but under the guise of a game to make it a little bit more fun. So for this one, I used this with my AP class, and I just had these 4 different prompts for each one. And I chose Boardwalk for, giving the first reaction to an artwork in progress. So they had to write this down, and this was like on a full sheet of paper. And then the second one was questions that I have for the artist after that kind of first response. And then any questions that you could ask. And for this one, I had a what if question, but you can change that up. And then any last minute thoughts, or where do you think they should go next? You could use that last one however you wanted. But it worked out really well when I was in school. The only downfall of this is that your critique and feedback sessions, which are normally in my classroom pretty loud and there's a lot going on, this was a really quiet because everybody was working. I did this in teams. I have critique teams of 4 to 5 kids. So everybody was writing feedback for students. So when a student left class, here's an example. So these were 2 of the examples that this student got based on this work. So they got 4 pieces of paper with some written feedback from their students, which might be more than they would normally get. Now, when I think about how to do Monopoly, I feel like you could do it in Flipgrid and set it up using similar prompts. You could put this graphic organizer in a Google Slide presentation with artwork and have kids still kind of answer in that same format. I found just using these fun things like Boardwalk, Chance, and calling it Monopoly, even though I could have really easily written it out, give me your first response, and then have it a paragraph. Kids were more engaged just because of how I sold it and kind of that presentation. They seemed more likely to do it. And right now, I think we're all looking for different ways to engage kids other than a question and an empty spot for them to answer to. So that's kind of my graphic organizer for that. And it worked really well. And some kids really liked it because they felt that they got to hear from everybody in their group, especially the kids that might not participate.
This is also a way in terms of leveling up, because again, I Spy is based around identifying and using vocabulary. This one, we're starting to get the kids to level up, trying different ways of kind of using that feedback. So that first response is that kind of base level, what they see, how they're responding to it. That second level, students need to understand that feedback is not just direct statements. It can be questions. It's meant to, again, guide the goal, push that goal forward. And sometimes the best way to push that goal forward is to ask the artist a question. Why are you using it this way? How do you want me to see this? And that community chest, especially if you use, again, you can use that for a spot where you can put in like sentence stems to get them started. So like it's a good thing for like that what if. It gives them a chance to kind of like think through, again, pushing that level of feedback besides just a straight identifying. And again, it's meant to get them so they see it's comfortable. And again, it's right now, this is a chance you could use this if you want to start them for like a large group critique, get them to actually start this and then have discussions. Or it can be used where you literally hand the sheets back to the student. And again, they get a chance to kind of respond. You will have some things where kids will complain that they can't always read each other's handwriting. But again, that way you could also then direct them to be like, okay, find that person, talk directly to them. So again, it's one of those ones where it's a nice, easy way to get them to level up, where they don't always see that they're leveling up, but they are.
Thanks, Aaron. And I think we covered all of these. It's pretty self-explanatory. And I've had other teachers in other departments who've asked to use it. So it's something that I think it's not just something that can be used for art. I feel like the idea is something that can be used in other content areas as well.
Okay, feedback dice. This is a one where, again, sometimes when you do big critiques, students don't know always where to go. Some of them have like lots of things they can play off of. This is one where it gives the kids a sense of chance. So they have, again, the way we normally do this is with dice, where we actually have little cubes, the cubes are rolled, and then the students play off of those sentence stems to kind of direct the feedback. So this is our way of directing the feedback in a critique. You can do it as pairs, you can do it in teams, I've seen it done with like large groups where you actually like, again, you almost have the full group. Although you will see a lot of us, we do things more kind of pared down. As we're doing this, again, I want the kids to get more comfortable doing small groups so everybody gets a chance to talk. Because again, one of the things in terms of feedback, it's very easy for a student to hide in large group critiques. So a lot of stuff we've been doing is more of, we're going to kind of have them do it in their own small swimming pools before we throw them in the ocean. Okay. So again, it's meant to get them comfortable with the process. And again, these are meant to guide the students so they see kind of how to level up, how to use these questions. And again, some of them are used to us saying it, but this way now they get a chance to kind of put it in their own words and express it toward the person they're giving feedback to. So again, our goal is to get the students seeming more like they're the teacher and offering up that kind of, facilitation to other students. It also takes away from those I shoulds that you'll get a lot of times in critiques, because again, that you want them to take away that the student has complete control of their own artwork. And again, that the feedback is meant to be suggestions. So again, this way it guides them with sentence stems to kind of give that feedback in a way that should help the artist move forward.
And the other thing that I found, especially with my beginning level kids, is that I don't just have them roll the dice and then answer the question. I have them roll the dice to figure out what am I going to say. So then if I roll the dice and I land on how does your work get you out of your comfort zone, I still have to say that and then ask someone else. So I'm still using that language when I'm posing that question to someone else, which I think is really important, because then that language starts to become ingrained in me as I'm starting to become an artist.
Again, these, if you look over some of the slides, we did some that, again, are ones that we want to try and guide the students with. So again, they're ones we kind of use in most of our critiques. Again, you can upgrade depending on, all this again was, you took a dice. I just actually took, Carrie uses it and makes paper copies. I take again, I'm part of a theater department, so I'm able to cut little chunks of scrap wood and this make sticker paper and then wrap the dice so the kids get a chance to roll it. But again, you can make whatever ones you want. Again, the goal is that the prompts kind of guide how you want the students to kind of give that feedback. And again, it's meant to get the students to feel comfortable using the language, but also get them to reinforce the language so that's, part of their comfort zone just as much as part of ours. If you go to the next slide, this one is one we're trying to figure out a way you could do this in a setting that is not where the kids have direct access to each other. So one of the ways we thought about it is most students have some kind of board game at home. So you could take a regular dice, roll that dice, and where the number corresponds to which one you have one sheet versus a second sheet. Or if they don't have dice, Google has a number generator. You just set the max depending on if you want to be like sheet 1, we're just going to set the max to 6. And again, it's like a dice that randomly will choose. We were thinking maybe use this as a flip grid where the students would basically choose, like, do 3 rolls of the dice, and those 3 are what you're going to address. And another student has sent you an artwork, and then they, to give them feedback, address these 3 questions. Anything you want to add to that, Carrie?
No, I guess I'll see next week if it'll work online.
Again,
but I think the flip grid thing, but then still kind of, because we've used some games in our classroom before, I still think going back to some of the same things that we've done in our classroom, but kind of twisting them so that they work online is going to help kids feel more comfortable that, yes, this is still the same. This is still my art class. So I think that comfort level will help them along as they're processing through all of this.
And again, the biggest one of this one, it gives them sentence stems that they get used to actually have to kind of, again, see how that creates that higher level of feedback. So it gets them away from just having to like make their own little statements. The biggest thing, it does take some time, so just be aware of that. And again, we're going to be testing out the Flipgrid version, and if you want some feedback on that, email us in about 2 weeks. We probably have some.
Yeah. Another thing that I do is Foursquare feedback. You'll find I use a lot of tables and grids. I can't remember which speaker that I had heard talked about that. One of the reasons that I do that is because it gives kids a place of, I want this information here. It's easy to then to kind of visually go back to and access, oh yeah, that was on that top square. Our kids are visual learners, and they can kind of remember that information as you start to visually group it. So something similar. I do this where we do several rounds, and whether it's musical chairs or whether they're rotating at their tables, because I also do a lot of like physical purposeful movement. I do different rounds of things, and then I ask them to comment on different things in that round so that they're getting different feedback, because I don't want everybody to say the same thing. So I make sure that as I'm changing my rounds up, I'm also changing up kind of what I'm looking for. But then also that last question that I think is really important for Foursquare feedback. The first one is they have to say what they want feedback on. And I feel like that can be really easily done in Flipgrid. And then have these kind of prompts for different kids to respond to. But then the last thing that I think is really important is that reflective piece. Now that I've gotten this feedback, people have said this, now what am I going to do with it? So that's why I always try to include that somewhere. Whether it's in the AP Google Slides that they're keeping. So that's kind of where I'm at with Foursquare feedback. Again, I'm not using necessarily a word bank, but this would be something that I would go do more of a level 2 as I'm starting to move things up. And
one thing also that, again, Carrie's very good at this. She, again, starts to have the students really addressing the feedback they want. As you start doing this from, like, again, your beginning level all the way up to your AP, you will start getting students where they expect more out of their peers. So that if a student is giving them just level 1, you will see them actually call them out on it and be like, I need something more from you. So, but also be aware as you get students to understand how feedback works, and then again, the guiding forces to get that main goal, you will also see students calling out you as a teacher to make sure that they get what they want out of you, but they also may call out other teachers who are not giving them what they hope for. And you may have to have a discussion about how you do that in a polite manner, because sometimes they get used to wanting things and not realizing that everybody is doing the same things we are. So just be aware of that. That is one of the things that, yes, it gets students to be more aware of what they are looking for in terms of what they hope to kind of guide that goal, but they can also need to know how to ask for it properly.
Correct. The question game. This is perfect. And I do it a lot in my advanced classes. I don't know that I would do it with the beginning level class, at least not in like mid-year, maybe at the end. But it's been really valuable. We also refer to it as speed dating in my class, because it's basically kind of that same situation. It is a little bit riskier, and you're looking at doing this with a partner. So you have to have 2 people. And then really basically I set it up so there's rows of people. So like my inside circle stays, my outside circle is potentially moving every couple of minutes. And it is a timed activity. So that's really an important thing that I don't know how I'm going to replicate online. But then I structure some prompts. So for the first person is the artist, and then the second person becomes the questioner. So we go through all of these 3 rounds with one person, and then we flip-flop. During that first minute, the artist can respond to questions that they've been asked by the questioner. And then after that first round, when that minute's up, I give them about 30 seconds to write down any notes. I call that their brain dump. It's really important so they can kind of keep track of what's important during that session. And then in that second round, again, the same person is the artist, the same person is the questioner throughout all 3 rounds for this first time. Then I'm going to give them a prompt, and so that they can ask questions just related to that prompt. That's 1 minute. And then I do a brain dump.
Can you address kind of like a prompt you'd give them? So example, sometimes it could be like the prompt could be like, you could ask questions specifically on composition. You could ask questions specifically on the background. So again, the prompt isn't like, it's meant to guide them to what you're kind of focusing on in class. to reinforce vocabulary, but also to get them to address that directly in their pieces.
Right. And then sometimes it leads kids to realize, and the reason I use questions is because it's easier for kids to come to the realization on their own when they've been questioned about these things. They kind of start to realize that, wait, maybe my background and my figure, they absolutely have no connection whatsoever, and people aren't getting it. So they're coming to a lot of realizations on their own through this process, which is why I do it for an in progress. And then that last round is only what if questions. And here's the kicker. The artist can't respond. So for 1 minute, the artist or the questioner is asking, what if you tried yellow? What if you turned it upside down? What if you added? So that they're asking all of these questions that they could potentially see, or to even maybe drive different media, anything that they could think of that really could go way far out there to give them some ideas on what they could potentially do. And then they do a brain dump. So the first one, the artist is asking, or the questioner, is asking questions. Just random questions that they're thinking of as they're starting to look and kind of take in and process the evidence that's in front of them. Then the second one, the teacher kind of drives that discussion for that minute with some prompts. And then the third one is really totally the student taking the information, the prompt, and really trying to really push the artist in that round 3 of all the different directions that they could go. And I will say it is exhausting because you have to be on for those 3 minutes. And 3 minutes doesn't sound like a lot of time, but it is when you are actively engaged in listening and asking and thinking. It's a long 3 minutes, which is why I have the brain dump in there for kids to write down in their sketchbook. I think that's really important. And then we switch that out.
Okay, so also reinforce the brain dump is huge. You do need that time because it is that time where the students need to kind of like, again, they're getting bombarded. Also, I will say this, that first round, you will literally see like the level of feedback kind of raise up in that kind of level 1 to level 2. Because again, that first round is usually it's going to be kind of that quick instantaneous response. They're kind of, again, taking in the artwork. The second one, again, they're more guided. But the third one is all about possibilities. And it's one where, especially if you have AP and they're kind of guiding that sustained investigation, it gets kids to also be like, we can come back to that because they're writing it down and be like, oh, maybe this is a way you want to look at this. Maybe this is a way you want to push this. When I do this, I really talk about students, and you have to be like in the moment. You have to, again, understand that feedback is to, like, again, they are your focus. You're not going to be, don't get distracted. Your main focus is you will give them attention, and that is what you need to go for. So it's one of those ones where you can really, reinforce that soft skill of, if you are a good listener, you must give that person your attention, your time for the whole time. Don't get distracted.
And this, I can get through about 4 different rounds of this. So you sit and do I question, and then I get questioned. So like where we both go through the rounds, and I can get through 4 sets of 4 pairs in a 45-minute class now that my kids kind of know the drill. So that kind of tells you how long the brain dump and how long just kind of that like processing takes. In terms of trying to figure this out, how to do online, I feel like the biggest thing is really the time. So I feel like you could take that same concept of time and you could say, ask this artist 10 questions. Because the whole point is, by the time you get to 10 questions, you're getting really better questions than those first 3 questions. And then you could still, again, lead those prompts, say ask 5 questions about composition, whereas normally a kid would maybe, just in a regular critique, would maybe ask 1 question about composition. So by changing the number of questions you're asking, whether it's in a Screencastify or whether it's a Flipgrid or however you're choosing to do it, but I think making sure that you're giving a higher number of questions so that it's really pushing them into those extra possibilities. Don't you think, Aaron?
I agree. And again, this one, right now, we're going to do some experimentation with different ways we can kind of play with this. This one, again, is very good when you have face-to-face. We're a little bit kind of lenient how we're maybe able to pull this off doing in our current circumstances. Because again, we've been told by our district some of the stuff that we may have access to maybe getting taken away in terms of some of the Google Meeting stuff, some of the things where students can't directly like socialize directly. So that could limit in different ways we can kind of present this and try and get this. The ones who are most used to this are like AP students. So we may try and come up with different versions related with that. I wouldn't try this directly if you've never done this and are going to be like, oh, I want to do something where I'm going to have the kids try and do this with Flipgrid, even though I've never done it.
Right.
They're going to be lost.
Yeah. No, I would say maybe the biggest thing would just be come up with 6 questions that you have for an artist. If you could do a Padlet and you could put up, kids could add work, you could add student work into that Padlet and then say, come up with 6 questions that you have for that artist. That is a doable thing. You could potentially make critique groups within Padlet and then kids can work that way. So I feel like Padlet might be also like a non-face-to-face, but still kids can collaborate, because I feel like right now one of the things that the kids are going to be missing the most is that collaborative piece. And I feel like Padlet still provides that. When you're doing it actually in the classroom, it's really just important that kids are sitting face-to-face and that they're giving that chance to brain dump. The other thing that I always do, and I think this is something that we're just going to have to do more and more of and be outside of the teacher comfort zone, is we have to model what we're expecting for students. So if we're asking for a Flipgrid, we're modeling what that would look like kind of with a buddy. This is where you maybe would use one of your own children to kind of be that person that you're practicing with before you put it out there, to kind of make sure that to have that sample for kids, I think is important, because the first time I do this in class, I give a student kind of a heads up and we kind of do a practice run through so the students can see what's expected of them. The other thing that I do
that works a lot very well, especially with like works in progress, because again, it gives that sense of possibility at the end, but it gets students to have to stand up for what their idea is as they're kind of working through it. So it gives them that chance to kind of take ownership more, even though some of them kind of are like, well, I'm kind of doing this, and a little bit of confusion. This again reinforces that. So that's one thing that's kind of going to be missed. Also, like Carrie will talk about this more, but it works very good if you have the student who always does the, whoops, I forgot it. Like it didn't go in my bag by accident, or, I left it here and I didn't get a chance to finish it. So it's one where you can easily turn somebody who forgets their stuff into that third-party observer who has to kind of document. I'll let Carrie take more on this one. She does more of this.
No, so if you have someone, or it's even not a bad idea, just if you have someone who's forgotten their work, or you want to have some kids that are really observing kind of what's going on, you give a kid a clipboard and a piece of paper and you make them the observer, and they have to write down what they heard, what did they see. And then the cool thing about that is then the person gets those at the end, because you can't always stay and process in all of that information. It seems like 3 minutes is really short, but having that extra third-party observer catches all of the things that you might have missed. So it works out really well. I would say the biggest thing about some of the games and the things that we are showing you is really trying to make them sound fun and exciting. A game sounds way more fun than a quiz. I mean, I know they're not the same thing, but I think really looking at how you're projecting what you're going to do in the format that you're giving students, I think is going to potentially change some perception. As if you're excited about it, I think the kids are going to potentially be excited about it. At least there's hope for that. That's kind of my thought. That's kind of my last words.
And again, as Carrie kind of mentioned, the biggest thing, especially with high school students, that they kind of forget is that learning is something we do every day. And again, it's usually the more enjoyable, the more also things we remember are experiences. So the more you can kind of make, if we just sit there and go like, oh, you're doing a standard critique, they kind of like, Whereas if we add a little kind of game element to it, it's more about the experience and they remember the experience. So that's one of the things we really work to trying to do, is trying to make sure that that experience is part of what we're doing, reinforcing the learning, because then they're always like, remember when you did this, remember when you did that. It's that thing that kind of connects them back to it, and then reconnects them with that knowledge they already have.
I agree.
So,
and I'm going to be posting some things on Twitter as I try different things. And I think everybody is as I try different things with my kids, I'm going to post like, yay, it was a fail, or yay, it worked, and kind of look at how am I going to move forward from there. But I will try to keep posting on Twitter. And I'm also in the K-12 online art teachers. I feel like that's a really helpful group right now, as we're all kind of struggling with some of the same stuff right now. So stay safe.
Thank you for your time.
Yep.